This man used to work at the embassy of Equatorial Guinea in the country of Serbia. Because he was far from his wife, he discovered that his wife was cheating on him with Baltasar in Gonga. Listen to how this man was hurt by this.
I had retired from my position at the Equatorial Guinea office in Serbia a few months ago. After years of serving my country in foreign lands, it was time to finally come home to put down the briefcase and reconnect with my wife, Rita, who had always been the anchor of my life. We had been through a lot together, living in different countries, adjusting to new cultures, handling the stress of my work, and now, in retirement, I expected things to settle down. A peaceful life, just the two of us, enjoying the years that had yet to come. But it didn't happen that way. It all began when I found a letter. I wasn't looking for it, not at all. I had no reason to question Rita's loyalty, or so I thought. We'd been married for over a decade, and I trusted her implicitly. But one day, I was cleaning out an old drawer in our study when something caught my eye, a letter addressed to Rita, but it wasn't from any old friend or family member. No, this letter had a name I hadn't heard in a long time, Baltasar in Gonga. Baltasar was the head of the National Financial Investigation Agency in Equatorial Guinea, a man of considerable influence and power. I had met him a few times during my time working in Serbia. He seemed like a professional, driven by his role in the government, but I didn't think much of him beyond that. After all, he was someone I had regarded as an ally in the fight against corruption in our country. But as I read through the letter, my hands started to tremble. What I thought was just a professional correspondence quickly became something far more personal. The language was intimate, filled with references to secret meetings, moments shared in silence, and emotions that were far too deep for a mere professional relationship. This wasn't just a letter. It was a confession. The truth hit me like a punch in the gut. Rita, my wife, had been having an affair with Baltasar for months, maybe even longer. All the late nights, the unexplained absences, the moments when she seemed distant, it all made sense now. The man I had once trusted, the man I thought I could count on, had betrayed me. And so had Rita. At first, I couldn't even process it. It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. My mind raced with questions, with disbelief. How could she do this? How could Baltasar, of all people, be involved? He was a figure of authority, someone who held the keys to the financial integrity of our nation. How did I miss all of this? The next few days were a blur. I couldn't confront her immediately. I needed to think, to understand the situation before I made any decisions. The anger, the pain, the betrayal were suffocating. I replayed every moment, every conversation, every glance that I thought meant something, only to realize it had all been a lie. Finally, I confronted her. She had been acting different, I could tell. But nothing could have prepared me for the confrontation. I sat her down in our living room, the one place that had always been a sanctuary for both of us, and asked her about the letters. Her face went pale, and she didn't try to deny it. "I'm sorry," Rita whispered, and her voice barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I never meant for it to go this far." My heart shattered. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but the damage had already been done. How could I ever look at her the same way again? How could I trust her? And Baltasar, he was no better. The man I thought was a figure of integrity had taken advantage of my absence, my trust, and had crossed a line that could never be undone. The betrayal cut deeper because of his position. He wasn't just any man. He was someone who had power over the very financial systems I had worked my entire career to protect. His manipulation wasn't just personal, it was political. It was a breach of trust, of everything I had stood for. I spent the following days questioning everything. My relationship with Rita seemed irreparable. The life we had built together felt like a house of cards, crumbling before me. I knew I would have to confront Baltasar, but I wasn't sure how. I was no longer a diplomat, and no longer in the position of power I once held. But this wasn't about diplomacy, this was personal. This was my life, my marriage, my trust that had been shattered. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence and a tension that seemed to weigh down every corner of the house. Rita was quiet, remorseful, but there was no way to undo the damage. I couldn't look at her without seeing the ghost of her betrayal, and she could feel it too. We were strangers living in the same house, and no amount of apologies or explanations would change the reality between us. I had always been a man of reason, someone who relied on his intellect to navigate challenges. But this was different. There was no protocol to follow, no diplomatic channels to work through. This wasn't about nations or politics, this was about betrayal, a personal wound that could never be healed by words alone. I knew I needed answers from Baltasar, but the thought of confronting him in person felt like an impossible task. He wasn't just an acquaintance anymore, he was a threat to my entire life. He had violated everything I believed in. Still, I had to face him. I couldn't let him get away with this. I reached out to an old contact from my time in Equatorial Guinea, a trusted associate who still had connections within the country's government. I needed to know where Baltasar was, what his position was now, and if there was any way I could hold him accountable. The man on the other end of the line was hesitant at first, but after some coaxing, he agreed to help. He's still in power, my contact told me quietly. But there's talk that he's been overstepping. You're not the only one who feels betrayed by him. Be careful, though. He's dangerous. Dangerous. The word echoed in my mind, but I didn't care. He had to be held accountable, no matter the cost. I couldn't allow him to continue with his manipulation and deceit, especially when it had affected my marriage so deeply. This wasn't just about personal vendettas, it was about justice. And I wasn't going to back down. Over the next few days, I began to piece together a plan. I would travel to Equatorial Guinea, find Baltasar, and confront him directly. But it wasn't just a confrontation I sought. I wanted to expose him, to reveal the corruption he had allowed to fester under his watch. If I could expose him for what he truly was, perhaps the damage he had caused could be undone. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. He was powerful, and I was just a man with nothing left to lose. The night before I was set to leave, Rita approached me. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as she reached out to me. I never meant for any of this to happen, she said, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I love you, and I'll do anything to make things right. I looked at her, the woman I had spent so many years with, and felt nothing but emptiness. The love I had once felt seemed distant, like a memory from another life. You've already made your choices, Rita, I said softly, my voice devoid of the anger I had expected to feel. There's nothing more to say. With that, I turned away. I couldn't afford to be dragged back into the emotional turmoil of our marriage. I had a mission now, something far more important than salvaging a relationship that had already crumbled. The next morning, I boarded the flight to Equatorial Guinea. The weight of what I was about to do hung heavy in the air. I wasn't sure if I was seeking justice, revenge, or simply closure. But as the plane soared through the sky, I knew one thing for certain, that I wasn't coming back the same person. No matter what happened, I would never be the same. When I landed, the humid air of Malabo greeted me like a slap to the face. The city had always felt like home, but now it felt foreign, tainted by the shadow of betrayal. I made my way to the office of the National Financial Investigation Agency, where Baltasar worked, hoping that confronting him in person would give me the answers I needed. His secretary, the sharp-eyed woman with an air of indifference, glanced up at me when I entered the lobby. Can I help you? She asked, not bothering to hide her skepticism. I need to speak with Baltasar in Ganga, I said, my voice firm. She raised an eyebrow. Do you have an appointment? I hesitated for a moment before replying, oh no. But he will see me. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Instead, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. I could feel my pulse quicken as I waited, knowing that any moment could change the course of everything. A few minutes later, she hung up the phone and motioned for me to follow her. He'll see you now, she said curtly, leading me down a corridor to a large, imposing office at the end. The door opened, and there he was, Baltasar in Ganga. The man who had shattered my life, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, looking as composed and confident as ever. His eyes flickered with recognition as I stepped inside. Well, he said with a smirk, leaning back in his chair. It's been a long time. What brings you here, my old friend? The words I had prepared vanished in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. This wasn't just about my marriage. It was about a corrupt system that had allowed men like him to thrive. I wasn't going to let him get away with it, not this time. I'm here for the truth, I said, my voice steady. And I'll make sure the world knows what kind of man you really are. Balthasar was stronger than I had ever anticipated, not just in the physical sense, but in the way he had woven his influence so deeply into the fabric of the system. When I first thought about confronting him, I had imagined a man who could be outsmarted, maybe even intimidated into submission. After all, he had been a colleague, a peer once. But what I didn't fully grasp then, what I began to understand in those tense moments in his office, was how adept he had become at playing the game of power. He didn't just hold power through fear or force. He had become a master manipulator, a puppet master with strings attached to nearly every important figure in the country. As much as I wanted to see him as just a corrupt official, an overbearing figure whose empire was built on deceit, I began to see the magnitude of his reach. He had entrenched himself in every level of the political and business landscape in Equatorial Guinea. The people who worked for him weren't just employees, they were loyal to him in a way that bordered on worship. That smirk of his, the calmness with which he dismissed my threats, told me everything. It wasn't arrogance. It was the self-assurance of someone who knew he had layers upon layers of protection. He had friends in high places, connections that went far beyond the government into the very institutions that were supposed to hold men like him accountable. He had long ago ensured that any investigation into his actions would be stonewalled, buried before it could gain any momentum. I saw it in the way his secretary had ushered me into his office without question, as if she were just another pawn who had been carefully placed there. I saw it in his words, measured, calculated, always shifting the conversation in his favor, always deflecting. He had learned not just to control people, but to manipulate their very perceptions of him. But perhaps what struck me most was how easily he managed to stay calm, even in the face of my accusations. He didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. He simply smiled. He was in control, and the realization hit me hard. It wasn't that he hadn't already anticipated someone like me coming after him. He had probably planned for it. The game I had thought we were playing was one of truth versus lies, right versus wrong. But Balthasar had already transformed it into a game of survival, one where power and influence trumped morality. I wasn't just dealing with a man anymore, I was facing an institution built around his name, his will, his vision. He had anticipated every move I could make. The information I thought I had on him was nothing compared to what he had on me. What struck me with the full weight of his power was how little leverage I really had. He was protected not just by money, but by a network that ran so deep I couldn't even begin to fathom it. And perhaps that was the hardest pill to swallow, that Balthasar had become so deeply embedded in the very system that should have stopped him, that undoing his influence wasn't just about confronting him, it was about dismantling a system that was designed to keep people like him in power forever. In the end, I realized that exposing him was going to be far more difficult and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But as much as the odds were stacked against me, I couldn't back down now. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about a reckoning. And if I had to fight against every force he had set up to protect himself, then that's exactly what I would do. But as I left his office, the weight of his words continued to echo in my mind. "You have no idea what you're up against," he'd said, the smugness in his voice never faltering. At the time, I had dismissed it as just another psychological maneuver. But now, it felt like a prophecy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial, something that could tip the balance of this precarious game. I had thought I could outmaneuver him with the truth. But Balthasar was not merely a liar, he was a master of creating realities where truth was irrelevant. In his world, perception was everything, and he had already painted the narrative in his favor. I had seen that in the way he handled the press, the way his supporters rallied behind him at the slightest hint of opposition. It was as if the truth didn't matter as long as people believed in his version of events. I needed more than just a few incriminating documents or leaked reports. I needed a way to break through the wall of influence he had carefully built, to get under his skin, to find a crack no matter how small in his empire. But how? I couldn't just charge in recklessly. Not anymore. He had resources that could make me disappear without a trace, and I knew that if I was going to succeed, I had to outsmart him. I had to become more than just a thorn in his side. I needed to become the thing he feared most. As I walked down the dimly lit corridor of the building, I realized the depth of my mistake in underestimating him. I had thought I could confront him head-on, but Balthasar wasn't someone you faced directly. He was a shadow, a figure in the background, pulling strings while remaining untouchable. My first instinct had been to confront him with the facts, to expose him. But perhaps that was where I had gone wrong. He had already anticipated that. I had to think like him. If he could manipulate perceptions, then so could I. If he could plant stories and twist narratives, then I needed to do the same but smarter. I needed allies, but more importantly, I needed information that was untouchable. Something he couldn't silence or manipulate with a mere wave of his hand. In the coming days, I began to reach out to those who had once worked with Balthasar, those who had been close to him and his operations. Some had fallen out of favor with him, others had been bought off. The former were the ones I needed, but they were cautious, fearful. Balthasar didn't tolerate betrayal, and those who spoke out against him often found themselves exiled or worse. But there were cracks, I knew. Even the most secure fortress had them. I just had to find them before Balthasar sealed them off. The more I dug, the more I realized that Balthasar's influence wasn't just political. It was personal. People didn't just serve him out of fear, they served him because they owed him something, whether it was money, a favor, or even their own personal secrets. That was his strength, his web. He had made so many people indebted to him that exposing him would require not just revealing his corruption but tearing apart the very relationships he had cultivated over years. And that would take time. But time was something I no longer had. Balthasar knew I was a threat. His warning in that office had been calculated, and I had no doubt he was already planning his next move. The clock was ticking when I could feel the walls closing in around me. I had to act quickly. But this time, I would do things differently. I wouldn't play by his rules. I would break them. I would take his game and turn it against him. And if I had to destroy everything he had built, every connection, every ally, so be it. Because the only thing worse than fighting against a man like Balthasar was knowing I had given up without even trying. And I couldn't live with that. Not now. Not after everything. I had always trusted Rita, and that trust was my biggest mistake. She was my wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone. But as it turned out, I didn't know her at all. At first, the signs were subtle. Small things that seemed insignificant: extra hours at the office, the vague business meetings that kept her away more and more often. She'd come home late, her phone hidden away when I walked into the room, or she'd give me quick, distracted answers when asked where she'd been. I had convinced myself it was all nothing. Life gets busy, I told myself. I didn't want to believe she was hiding something from me. And yet, something in the pit of my stomach told me I wasn't being naive, I was being willfully blind. Then came the trip she took without telling me beforehand. She said it was a work conference, one she'd forgotten to mention until the last minute. She left for 3 days, but something felt off. I checked the flight details she had left in her bag, and instead of the conference city she'd mentioned, it led to a place I didn't recognize. The question gnawed at me, and when she returned, her story didn't add up. The way she avoided my gaze, the tension in her voice, it all told me she wasn't being honest. I couldn't let it go. So I began to look closer. Her emails were meticulously hidden, her phone constantly locked. But I wasn't stupid. I managed to access her old computer, the one she hardly used anymore. That's when I found it, the first clue. It was a single, innocuous-looking email buried beneath weeks of correspondence. But when I opened it, the message was chilling. Baltasar wants to meet again. Be careful. Don't let anyone know. The name sent a jolt through me. Baltasar. I had heard that name before. Whispers in the political circles, rumors of a man whose influence was as vast as it was insidious. I never imagined that he would have anything to do with Rita, or that she would have anything to do with him. The more I searched, the more I found. There were plans, dates, locations, notes, covert meetings with Baltasar. It wasn't just a professional connection, it was personal. And it wasn't just about business, either. I found messages exchanged in the dead of night, coded language meant only for them. It became clear to me then, Rita had been lying to me all along, not just about a few late nights or missed meetings, but about the very nature of her relationship with Baltasar. She was involved in something much bigger than I ever imagined. I confronted her one night after I had pieced everything together. The house was quiet, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. When she walked in, I didn't wait. I couldn't. Why, Rita? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. Why all the lies? What is it with you and Baltasar? Her face remained calm, too calm. She had always been good at keeping her composure, but this time, I could see the crack in her armor. The guilt was written all over her face, even if she refused to admit it. You don't understand, she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her. You never did. Never did what? I shot back, my patience snapping. Understand what? That you've been lying to me. That you've been working with him this whole time. Her eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw something in them I didn't recognize: coldness, maybe even resentment. You always saw yourself as the hero, she said. But you never saw how small you were in this world. Baltasar is someone who can give me everything you couldn't. Power. Influence. Safety. I did what I had to do. Safety. I repeated, incredulous. You put us in danger for safety. You've been working with him, manipulating me, lying to my face, and now you're telling me it was for my own good. She looked away, her silence telling me more than words ever could. She had betrayed me, but she had betrayed herself even more. She had become so entangled in Baltasar's web that she no longer knew where she ended and he began. It wasn't just about power or ambition for her, it was about survival, about needing him more than she ever needed me. And that, more than anything, hurt the most. You never understood me, she said quietly, as if she was speaking to herself. But now you do. I didn't know what to say. How do you respond when the woman you love has fallen into a world so dark that there's no way back? How do you fight against something as vast as Baltasar's network when your own wife is the one pulling the strings? I had to make a choice. Either I walked away from this mess, tried to move on, or I fought. And I couldn't walk away, not now. I would have to expose her, expose him, and everything they had built together. I would tear down their empire, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. But to do that, I needed to play their game. And in that moment, I realized if I was going to outsmart Baltasar, I'd have to become just like him. I would need to use the very lies they'd woven against them. And Rita? She was no longer my wife, she was just another player in the game. And if I had to destroy everything, so be it. I would burn their world to the ground. It wasn't until weeks later, after I'd started playing my part in Baltasar's game, that I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected, something that would turn everything I thought I knew upside down. It began innocently enough. I was at home, alone, going through Rita's things again, looking for anything that might give me an advantage in the war I was waging. I had become increasingly skilled at locating hidden details, whether it was through old devices, misplaced papers, or forgotten passwords. But this time, it wasn't about a piece of paper or a secret email. It was about something much more personal and much darker. I had found an old, unused camera in a drawer. Rita had always been meticulous about keeping things in order, but this particular camera seemed out of place. It wasn't something she'd ever used for photography or videos, not that I could recall. but when I picked it up, I noticed it had a small SD card inside. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I plugged it into the computer and began searching through its contents. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were dozens of videos, short clips, some only a few seconds long, others stretching for several minutes. At first, the videos seemed innocuous: Rita and Balthazar talking in hushed tones, sitting in what appeared to be a luxurious hotel room, their faces half lit by the glow of a dim lamp. They exchanged words in a language I didn't understand, but I could tell they weren't just discussing business. The way they looked at each other, the way their voices softened and grew intimate, told me all I needed to know. These weren't just work meetings. These were moments of something far more personal. The worst part wasn't just the footage itself, it was the way they had filmed it. They had known the camera was there and knew that they were being recorded. This wasn't an accidental capture, it was intentional. The angles, the way they framed the shots, it was all calculated. They wanted these videos, these moments of their clandestine relationship, preserved. They wanted the world to see them, or perhaps, more accurately, they wanted me to see them. In one video, Rita leaned close to Balthazar, her hand brushing his chest as they spoke in hushed tones. The warmth in her smile, the softness in her eyes as she looked at him, it was a look I had never seen directed at me. Not once. Another video was even more chilling. They were sitting across from each other, eyes locked, a quiet tension hanging in the air. Then Balthazar reached out, and they shared a brief kiss, the camera capturing every detail. I could hardly breathe as I watched the truth unfolding before me like a slap to the face. I had been blind. I had thought their relationship was strictly business, maybe even dangerous, yes, but business nonetheless. This was betrayal on a level I couldn't have imagined. It wasn't just that they had filmed these moments, carefully capturing them on camera. It was the knowledge that these were meant to be kept hidden, or meant to be a secret. The videos were not for the world, they were for themselves. A twisted trophy of their actions. A reminder of their power over me. I couldn't look away from the screen, although every part of me wanted to. I needed to know more. I needed to understand why. What had I missed? Why had Rita gone so far? It was all there, buried in those hidden videos, pieces of the puzzle that I couldn't ignore any longer. The worst moment came when I saw a video that showed them planning something. They were discussing a meeting, the location and time flashing on the screen as Rita nodded along. But it was the way they spoke of it that terrified me. There was an undertone of danger, an implication that whatever they were about to do would push them even further into the shadows. And they were prepared for it, prepared to do whatever it took. I stopped the video, my hands trembling, as the weight of everything I had uncovered sank in. It wasn't just betrayal I was dealing with. It was manipulation. It was control. Balthazar had turned Rita into something I no longer recognized. And I had been a pawn all along. The camera, the videos, they weren't just evidence of their affair. They were evidence of the larger game they were playing. A game I hadn't even realized I was a part of until now. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast. Every step I had taken, every decision I had made, had been leading me to this moment. But now, I had something on them, something that could bring everything crashing down. I just had to use it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just fighting Balthazar anymore. I was fighting Rita.